What if I told you that the founding fathers weren't just battling the British, but also a diet so bizarre it would challenge everything you thought you knew about 18th century food? Prepare to have your assumptions about colonial cuisine shattered as we explore the truly unsettling, yet historically fascinating, dishes that fueled a nation in its infancy. We're delving into the surprisingly unsettling culinary landscape of 1776, unearthing the bizarre and often unpalatable dishes that fueled a nascent nation. From questionable meat preparations to unsettling vegetable concoctions, we'll explore how necessity and limited resources shaped a diet, both historically fascinating and disturbingly bland. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1. The revolutionary breakfast expanded when Americans woke in 1776. Breakfast was a hearty, practical affair designed to fuel a long day of manual labor that would begin before sunrise and continue until well after sunset. Unlike the quick coffee and toast of today, or the hurried grab of a granola bar while rushing out the door, colonists began their mornings with substantial meals that would sustain them until midday, understanding that their physical labor demanded serious fuel and that opportunities to eat might not present themselves again for many hours. The typical breakfast table featured hasty pudding, a thick cornmeal porridge sweetened with molasses or maple syrup, alongside cold meat left over from the previous night's supper, creating a combination of carbohydrates and protein that provided lasting energy for farm work, crafts, or whatever trade occupied the household. Wealthier families might enjoy chocolate drinks, a luxury imported from the Caribbean that signaled status and refined taste, while farmers and laborers started their day with hard cider or beer, as these were often safer to drink than questionable water sources that might carry diseases no one yet understood. Bread, when available, was dark and dense, made from rye or a mixture of grains rather than the refined wheat we know today, and it bore little resemblance to the fluffy white bread that would later become an American staple. The morning meal was eaten quickly, often standing or while preparing for the day's work, and rarely resembled the leisurely brunches or breakfast spreads of modern times where families might linger over coffee and conversation. The preparation of breakfast began well before the family rose, with the housewife or female servants rising in darkness to rekindle the fire that had been banked overnight, a process that required skill to coax flames from still glowing embers without wasting precious kindling. The fireplace was the heart of breakfast preparation, and managing its heat for cooking, while simultaneously warming the house in winter months, required constant attention and years of experience to master properly. Hasty pudding earned its name from being relatively quick to prepare compared to other period dishes, though it still required constant stirring to prevent burning and achieving the right consistency that was neither too thick nor too watery. The cornmeal used in hasty pudding was ground from dried corn that had been stored since the previous fall's harvest, and families who owned their own hand mills would grind it as needed, while those without mills purchased it already ground or took their corn to a local mill for processing. The texture of colonial cornmeal was generally coarser than modern cornmeal, giving hasty pudding a grittier consistency that took some getting used to for those unfamiliar with it. Sweetening the porridge with molasses or maple syrup made it palatable and added precious calories, though poorer families might eat it plain or with just a small amount of sweetener carefully rationed to last through the winter months. Cold meat at breakfast typically meant slices of ham, bacon, or preserved pork from the barrels that every household maintained in their cellars or smokehouses, and the saltiness of these preserved meats was far more intense than modern Americans are accustomed to, requiring soaking or at least acceptance of a very salty flavor profile. Families who could afford it might have cold roast beef or mutton from the previous night's supper, though this was less common as fresh meat spoiled quickly and was therefore consumed soon after cooking, making leftovers a sometime thing rather than an everyday occurrence. The combination of salty meat and sweet porridge created a flavor balance that colonists found satisfying, and the protein from the meat was essential for those facing heavy physical labor. Wealthier urban families might also have eggs at breakfast, fried in lard or butter, though eggs were valuable enough that many families saved them for baking or sold them for extra income rather than consuming them daily. The eggs that did appear at breakfast were smaller than modern eggs, coming from heritage chicken breeds that laid less frequently and produced smaller eggs than today's commercial laying hens that have been bred for maximum production. Bread at breakfast came in many forms depending on the region and the family's wealth, but it was always substantial and filling in ways that modern enriched white bread is not. Cornbread, made in heavy iron skillets or baked in the ashes of the hearth, appeared frequently in southern and middle colonies where corn was abundant and wheat sometimes scarce. Johnnycakes, known by different names in different regions including journeycakes or shawny-cakes, were made from cornmeal mixed with water or milk and cooked on a griddle, creating a portable food that could be carried in a pocket or saddlebag for eating later in the day. Rye bread, dark and dense, with a distinctive sour flavor that came from the natural fermentation process, was common in New England and areas with German settlement, and it kept much longer than wheat bread, without going stale or moldy. Wheat bread, when families could afford it, and when the grain was available, was still nothing like modern sandwich bread, but rather a dense hearty loaf made from less refined flour that retained more of the wheat kernel, and therefore more nutrients, but also more texture and darker color. The bread was always consumed with butter when possible, as butter provided crucial fat calories and made the dense bread more palatable, though butter availability varied by season since cows produced less milk in winter months when pasture was unavailable. The beverages consumed at breakfast reveal much about colonial life and the differences between their world and ours, particularly the ubiquity of alcohol at the morning table. Hard cider was the most common breakfast drink for many colonists, consumed by adults and children alike, in quantities that would shock modern health authorities, but the alcohol content was generally lower than modern hard cider, and the beverage was viewed as wholesome and nutritious rather than intoxicating. Every farm that could manage it maintained an apple orchard, and the fall harvest was pressed into cider that filled barrels in the cellar, providing drink for the entire year until the next harvest came around. Beer and ale, homebrewed from barley, wheat, or corn, offered another option and was considered suitable for breakfast because it provided calories and nutrients while being safer than water from wells or streams that might be contaminated. The beer consumed at breakfast was typically small beer, meaning it had a lower alcohol content than the stronger beer reserved for evening drinking, but it was still recognizably alcoholic by our standards. The reason for this reliance on alcohol at breakfast and throughout the day was practical rather than purely recreational, as colonists had observed that people who drank beer and cider stayed healthier than those who drank water, though they didn't understand that the brewing process killed harmful bacteria and made the beverages safer. Chocolate, as a breakfast drink, was an expensive indulgence reserved for the wealthy, and it bore little resemblance to the sweet hot chocolate we drink today. Colonial chocolate was made by grating chocolate from a solid block, mixing it with hot water or milk, and often adding spices like cinnamon or cayenne pepper rather than sugar, creating a bitter, complex beverage that was believed to have medicinal properties. The chocolate itself came from cacao beans imported from Central and South America through Caribbean ports, making it expensive and subject to disruption whenever wars or weather interfered with trade routes. Families who served chocolate at breakfast were making a statement about their wealth and their connection to international trade networks, and they often served it in special chocolate pots that were specifically designed for the purpose. Coffee was beginning to appear at colonial breakfast tables by 1776, though it wouldn't become the dominant American breakfast beverage until after the Revolution made tea politically suspect and coffee the patriotic choice. The coffee colonists drank was strong and often mixed with milk and sugar when available, and it was brewed by boiling ground beans in water rather than using the filtered methods that would come later. Tea, when it appeared at breakfast in loyalist households or before the political tensions made it problematic, was precious and treated with great ceremony, even at the morning meal. The tea itself was imported from China via Britain, making it expensive and subject to the taxes that would eventually help spark revolution, and families would reuse tea leaves multiple times to extract every bit of value from them. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 had already made tea drinking a political statement by 1776, and many patriotic colonists had switched to coffee or herbal infusions made from local plants like strawberry leaves, raspberry leaves, or mint that they called Liberty tea. Milk, appeared at breakfast for farm families who had dairy cows consumed fresh and warm from the morning milking by children, especially though adults were somewhat suspicious of drinking large quantities of milk and preferred it in their porridge or chocolate. The milk came from cows of heritage breeds that produced less milk than modern dairy cows, but milk that was much higher in butterfat, giving it a rich, creamy quality that made everything it touched more satisfying. The timing of breakfast varied by occupation and season, but it generally occurred shortly after sunrise, once the most urgent morning chores were complete. Farm families would rise in darkness to tend animals, milk cows, gather eggs, and complete other essential tasks before sitting down to break their fast. And during harvest seasons they might snatch only a quick bite before heading to the fields where a more substantial meal would be brought to them later in the morning. Urban artisans and shopkeepers might eat breakfast slightly later after opening their shops or beginning their day's work, and wealthy families who did day face the demands of manual labor might breakfast even later in what they considered a more civilized fashion. The meal was typically eaten in the kitchen where it was prepared, with family members sitting on benches at a simple table, and the formality of the dining room was reserved for later meals and special occasions. Children ate what adults ate, with no special foods prepared for them, though babies and toddlers might have their porridge thinned or their meat cut into smaller pieces. The expectation was that everyone would eat heartily at breakfast, because the work ahead demanded it, and leaving food on one's plate was seen as wasteful in a way that our era of abundance has made us forget. Social class determined not just what appeared at the breakfast table, but the quality and variety of those items. A wealthy merchant's breakfast might include several types of bread, multiple choices of preserved meats, fresh eggs prepared in different ways, butter, cheese, jam or preserves, chocolate or coffee, and perhaps fresh fruit when in season. A middling farmer's family would have hasty pudding or cornmeal mush, some salt pork or bacon, bread with butter if the churning had been done recently, and cider to wash it down. A poor family, or one that had fallen on hard times, might have only cornmeal mush with a small piece of pork for flavoring, eaten from wooden bowls, with wooden spoons, accompanied by water when cider had run out. Enslaved people in southern colonies typically received only minimal breakfast rations, perhaps just cornmeal and a bit of salt pork, though they might supplement this by raising their own chickens and keeping small garden plots that provided eggs and vegetables when time allowed. Indentured servants ate with the family they served in some households, while in others they ate separately, and their contracts sometimes specified what quality of food they should receive to prevent masters from providing only the meanest fare. The revolutionary breakfast was thus a meal that reflected the agricultural rhythms of the year, the social hierarchies of colonial society, the practical demands of physical labor, and the limited preservation technologies that determined what foods could be kept and consumed. It was a meal that connected colonists to the land they worked, the animals they raised, the trades they practiced, and the communities they depended on for milled grain, butchered meat, and other necessities they couldn't produce themselves. As 1776 dawned and independence beckoned, colonists were eating breakfasts their grandparents would have recognized, carrying forward English traditions, adapted to American ingredients and circumstances, yet slowly creating something distinctly American without quite realizing it. The breakfast table would eventually become a site of American innovation and abundance, but in 1776 it remained a place of traditional foods, hard-won sustenance, and the quiet determination that would help carry the nation through the revolutionary struggle ahead. Segment 2. The Three Sisters and Native Influence Expanded. Colonial American cuisine owed an enormous debt to indigenous peoples who had been cultivating the land for thousands of years before European arrival, and whose agricultural knowledge represented the accumulated wisdom of countless generations adapting to the specific conditions of the American continent. The foundation of the Revolutionary-era diet rested on the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash crops that Native Americans had perfected through companion planting, a sophisticated agricultural technique that demonstrated deep understanding of plant biology long before European science could explain why it worked so effectively. These three crops were planted together in mounds, with corn providing a stalk for beans to climb beans, fixing nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn, and squash spreading broad leaves that shaded the ground to retain moisture and suppress weeds, creating a mutually beneficial system that was more productive than any of the crops would have been planted alone. Corn appeared in countless forms throughout the colonial diet, from cornbread and johnnycakes to hominy and corn pudding, making it far more central to American eating than wheat. And colonists who had initially resisted this, Indian corn as inferior to European grains, had learned through bitter experience that it was often the difference between survival and starvation in the New World. Beans provided essential protein and were slow cooked with salt pork into thick stews that could feed a family for days, supplementing or replacing meat when animals were scarce or too valuable to slaughter. Squash, both summer and winter varieties, filled the gap in fresh vegetables during lean months and could be stored in root cellars well into spring, providing crucial vitamins and minerals that prevented deficiency diseases. The debt colonists owed to Native American agriculture was immense and often unacknowledged, as the crops themselves and the knowledge of how to cultivate them had saved early settlements from starvation time and again. When English colonists first arrived in the early 1600s, they had attempted to grow European crops using European methods, an approach that failed catastrophically in the different climate and soil conditions of North America. Native Americans had shown colonists which crops would thrive in their new home, when to plant them according to local seasonal markers rather than European calendars, and how to prepare and cook these unfamiliar foods to make them nutritious and palatable. The famous story of Squanto teaching the Pilgrims to plant corn with fish as fertilizer represents just one example of the broader agricultural education that native peoples provided to struggling colonists, though by 1776 the origins of this knowledge were often forgotten or deliberately obscured, as colonists preferred to see themselves as self-sufficient rather than indebted to the people they were displacing. The varieties of corn, beans and squash that colonists grew in 1776 were the result of thousands of years of Native American selection and breeding, creating cultivars perfectly adapted to different regions and growing conditions across the diverse climates of eastern North America. Corn dominated the colonial diet to an extent that's difficult to overstate, appearing in meals from breakfast through supper in forms that demonstrated remarkable culinary creativity. Green corn, harvested while still tender and milky, was roasted in its husks over coals, boiled and eaten off the cob, or cut from the cob to add to succotash and other dishes. Dried corn was ground into various grades of cornmeal, from fine meal for delicate cakes to coarse grits for hearty porridges, and the grinding itself was often done using Native American methods with wooden mortar and pestles before European-style mills became common. Hominy, made by treating dried corn with lye made from wood ash to remove the tough outer hull, was a purely Native American food that colonists adopted, enthusiastically cooking it into porridges or grinding it into masa for different preparations. Cornbread appeared in countless regional variations, from the johnnycakes of New England made with just cornmeal, water, and salt to the richer southern corn pones that might include eggs and milk when available. Corn was also the primary grain used in colonial beer and whiskey production, as barley struggled in many American growing conditions while corn thrived. The versatility of corn meant that a successful corn harvest could sustain a family through the entire year, while a corn crop failure spelled potential disaster in ways that the loss of no other single crop could match. Beans in the colonial diet came in varieties that Native Americans had developed over millennia, including kidney beans, navy beans, black beans, and many others that each had specific growing requirements and culinary uses. The colonists learned to grow beans among cornstalks from Native Americans and also learned the importance of dried beans as a storage crop that could last for years if kept dry and protected from pests. Bean porridge, or bean pottage, was a mainstay of colonial cooking, made by slow-cooking dried beans with salt pork, onions when available, and herbs, creating a thick, nourishing stew that improved in flavor as it was reheated over several days. Boston baked beans, which would become famous, was essentially a colonial adaptation of Native American bean cooking techniques, combined with European ingredients like molasses and salt pork, slow-cooked overnight in a bean pot. Beans provided protein that was especially important for families who couldn't afford meat daily or during seasons when preserved meat was running low. And the combination of beans and corn created a complete protein that could sustain people even in the absence of animal foods. Fresh green beans or string beans appeared in summer gardens and were eaten as vegetables, either boiled with salt pork for flavoring or preserved through pickling for winter consumption. Squash varieties demonstrated remarkable diversity that reflected the different Native American cultures that had developed them. from the small summer squashes, eaten fresh, to massive winter squashes that could weigh dozens of pounds and store for months. Summer squash, harvested while still tender with edible skins, appeared in colonial gardens in the forms we still recognize today, including zucchini, yellow crookneck, and pattypan varieties, though colonists typically boiled them longer than modern cooks would find palatable. Winter squash, including pumpkins, butternut, acorn, and Hubbard squashes, were left to mature fully on the vine until their skins hardened, then harvested before the first frost and stored in cool cellars where they could last well into spring. Colonists learned from Native Americans to cook winter squash by baking it whole in the coals of the fire until the flesh became soft and sweet, then scooping out the interior to eat plain or mash with butter and spices. Pumpkin appeared frequently in colonial cooking, not primarily in pies as it would later, but in savory preparations, stewed with milk and spices, or even hollowed out and used as a cooking vessel for stews. Squash seeds were roasted and eaten as snacks, nothing wasted from these valuable crops that grew so prolifically with relatively little care once the gardener understood their needs. Succotash represents perhaps the most direct survival of Native American cuisine in colonial cooking, a dish whose very name comes from the Narragansett word msiquitash, meaning boiled corn kernels. The basic preparation combined corn and beans, often lima beans or shell beans, cooked together into a vegetable stew that might be enriched with meat, particularly in colonial adaptations of the dish. During summer when vegetables were fresh, succotash might include green beans, corn cut fresh from the cob, and perhaps summer squash, creating a dish that celebrated the three sisters in a single pot. Winter succotash used dried corn and dried beans that had been soaked overnight, creating a humbler but no less important dish that provided nutrition during the lean months. The proportions and additional ingredients varied by region and by household, with some cooks adding pork or bear fat for richness, while others kept it simple with just the vegetables and perhaps some herbs. Native Americans had traditionally cooked succotash in clay pots, but colonists adapted it to their iron kettles, and the dish became so fundamental to colonial cuisine that many families who made it regularly had forgotten or never knew its indigenous origins. The agricultural techniques colonists learned from Native Americans extended beyond just the three sisters to include broader principles of working with the land rather than fighting against it. Native Americans practiced controlled burns to clear underbrush and encouraged the growth of plants that attracted game animals, creating park-like forests that colonists often mistook for natural landscapes rather than carefully managed ones. They taught colonists about crop rotation before European science had developed the theory, understanding from experience that planting the same crop in the same place year after year depleted the soil. Native Americans showed colonists how to identify and harvest wild foods, including berries, nuts, roots, and greens that could supplement cultivated crops, knowledge that was especially valuable during the starving time of late winter and early spring before stored food ran out and new crops came in. They demonstrated fishing and hunting techniques adapted to American species and conditions, from building fish weirs to trap spawning fish to calling turkeys and deer. The material culture of Native American foodways also influenced colonists, who adopted cooking vessels, serving implements, and preservation techniques that worked better in the American context than the European methods they had brought with them. Specific ingredients beyond the three sisters also came from Native American agriculture and foodways, enriching colonial cuisine in ways that are often forgotten. Jerusalem artichokes, despite their misleading name having nothing to do with Jerusalem or artichokes, were a Native American cultivar that produced edible tubers and grew readily in colonial gardens. Sunflowers, cultivated by Native Americans for their nutritious seeds and oil, appeared in colonial gardens and provided food for both humans and the chickens that many families kept. Wild rice, gathered by Native Americans in the Great Lakes region, did play a large role in colonial diets, but was known and appreciated by those who lived in areas where it grew. Cranberries, native to North American bogs and unfamiliar to Europeans, were used by Native Americans, both fresh and dried, and colonists learned to appreciate their tartness and their keeping qualities. Maple sugar and maple syrup represented purely Native American technologies that colonists adopted wholesale. Learning to tap maple trees in late winter, boil down the sap over fires, and create sweeteners that could replace or supplement expensive imported sugar. The technique of tapping trees and boiling sap was entirely unknown in Europe, making this one of the few food technologies that flowed exclusively from Native Americans to colonists rather than being an adaptation of European methods to American ingredients. By 1776, the Native American influence on colonial cuisine was so thoroughly integrated that many colonists no longer recognized it as Native American at all, instead viewing foods like cornbread and succotash as simply American or even English. This forgetting was both genuine cultural absorption and deliberate erasure, as colonists preferred to see themselves as bringing civilization to a wilderness rather than learning from sophisticated cultures that had been managing the landscape for millennia. The irony was profound. Colonists were actively displacing Native Americans from their land while simultaneously depending on Native American crops, cooking methods, and agricultural knowledge for their very survival. The foods that sustained the Continental Army during the Revolution were largely Native American in origin. From the corn that was ground into meal for johnnycakes, to the beans that filled soldiers' stomachs, to the pumpkins and squash that supplemented their rations. Without the Three Sisters and the agricultural knowledge that made them productive, the colonial population could not have grown to the point where revolution was feasible, making Native American contributions to colonial foodways an essential but largely unacknowledged foundation of American independence. The debt was immense, unpaid, and by 1776 increasingly denied, as the young nation built itself on land and knowledge taken from the peoples who had first cultivated both. Segment 3. Regional differences. North and South expanded. The 13 colonies stretched across diverse climates and geographies, creating distinct regional food cultures by 1776 that reflected not just the land itself, but the different peoples who settled each region and the economic systems they developed. In New England, the rocky soil and harsh winters meant colonists relied heavily on preserved foods, salt cod from the Grand Banks, baked beans, slow-cooked in molasses, and seafood chowders thickened with ship's biscuit, creating a cuisine that was thrifty, practical, and built around making the most of limited resources. The middle colonies, blessed with fertile farmland, became the breadbasket of America, producing abundant wheat, rye, and barley that made them the envy of both northern and southern neighbors and created a more prosperous and varied food culture than either region could match. Southern colonists developed a cuisine influenced by African cooking techniques brought by enslaved people, incorporating okra, black-eyed peas, and rice into their daily meals, with rice becoming so dominant in the Carolina Low Country that it rivaled sugar in economic importance and created vast wealth, built on the backs of enslaved laborers who knew how to cultivate it. Virginia and Maryland tobacco planters maintained aspirations to English gentility, attempting to recreate elaborate British dishes even as they adapted to local ingredients, creating a hybrid cuisine that was neither fully English nor fully American, but something distinct to the Chesapeake region. The backcountry and frontier regions, regardless of latitude, shared a simpler diet focused on game corn and whatever could be grown in small clearings carved from the wilderness, creating yet another food culture that united people living on the edges of colonial settlement. From Georgia to Maine, New England's food culture was shaped profoundly by the region's geography and climate, which offered a short growing season, rocky soil that made farming difficult, and long, brutal winters that required extensive food preservation. The sea provided what the land could not, and coastal New Englanders developed an economy and cuisine built around fishing, particularly cod fishing on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, where fish were so abundant that they seemed inexhaustible. Salt cod preserved by heavy salting and drying until it became hard as wood could last indefinitely, and became a staple food that appeared on New England tables multiple times per week, soaked overnight to remove some of the salt, then boiled or creamed, or made into fish cakes. The fish itself was bland and tough compared to fresh fish, but it was reliable, affordable, and available year-round, making it essential to New England's survival. Chowder, a fish stew that took its name from the French chaudière, or cauldron, combined salt cod or fresh fish with salt pork, onions, and ship's biscuit or potatoes, creating a filling meal that stretched expensive ingredients with cheaper ones. Boston baked beans represented another quintessential New England dish, made from dried beans, slow-cooked overnight with molasses, salt pork, and sometimes mustard, traditionally prepared on Saturday to be eaten on Sunday when cooking was forbidden by Puritan religious observance. The Puritan heritage of New England created a food culture that valued simplicity, thrift, and suspicion of culinary excess as a form of sinful indulgence. Plain cooking was virtuous cooking in the Puritan mindset, and elaborate preparations or expensive ingredients were viewed with moral disapproval as manifestations of pride and worldliness. This didn't mean New Englanders ate poorly or without enjoyment, but it did create a cultural pressure toward modesty in food that contrasted sharply with the more openly celebratory food culture developing in the southern colonies. Thanksgiving feasts and Election Day celebrations provided approved occasions for abundance, when roasted turkeys, pies, and puddings could appear without moral censure. But everyday eating was expected to be plain and practical. The scarcity of wheat in New England meant that rye bread and cornbread dominated, with white wheat bread remaining a luxury that marked special occasions and higher social status. Dairy products were important when available, with butter, cheese, and milk supplementing the diet. Though winter months, when cows went dry, created seasonal scarcity, maple syrup and maple sugar, produced through techniques learned from Native Americans, provided sweetness that was more accessible than imported molasses or sugar for many New England families. The middle colonies, stretching from New York through Pennsylvania to Delaware, enjoyed agricultural advantages that made them the richest farming region of colonial America and created a more abundant and varied food culture. The soil was deeper and more fertile than New England's rocky ground. The growing season was longer, and wheat grew beautifully, making the middle colonies the primary wheat-producing region and earning them the nickname breadbasket of America. The wheat was milled into fine white flour that could be baked into light bread, a luxury that middle colony residents enjoyed more regularly than their northern or southern neighbors. The region's agricultural prosperity supported diverse farming, with farmers growing not just wheat but also rye, barley, oats, corn, and various vegetables, creating variety in the diet that reflected the underlying prosperity. The middle colonies also benefited from ethnic and religious diversity that brought different food traditions into contact and created culinary innovation. Dutch settlers in New York had introduced their traditions of cookies, waffles, coleslaw, and donuts, foods that were being absorbed into the broader colonial culture. German settlers in Pennsylvania brought their expertise in sausage making, sauerkraut production, and baking, including pretzels and various sweetbreads that enriched the regional cuisine. Quakers, particularly strong in Pennsylvania, brought their own food culture that valued simplicity like the Puritans, but with less severity, creating a prosperous but modest food tradition. The middle colonies' location made them important commercial centers where food from different regions was traded, and where urban markets offered variety unknown in more isolated areas. Philadelphia's markets sold produce, meat, and prepared foods from the surrounding countryside, creating a cosmopolitan food culture where people could access ingredients and dishes from different traditions. The rivers and harbors of the middle colonies supported both ocean fishing and the development of shad and herring fisheries, with these fish being caught in enormous quantities during spring spawning runs and either eaten fresh or preserved for later consumption. The abundance of game in the middle colony forests supplemented farmed meat, with deer, turkey, rabbit, and waterfowl all appearing on tables regularly. Pork remained the dominant meat, as it was elsewhere in colonial America. But the middle colonies' prosperity meant that beef appeared more frequently than in other regions, and wealthy families could afford mutton and lamb as well. The combination of agricultural fertility, ethnic diversity, commercial development, and general prosperity made middle colony food culture the most varied and abundant of any region. Though this was not distributed equally across all social classes, Southern colonial food culture was profoundly shaped by the plantation economy, the dominance of cash crops like tobacco and rice, and above all by the presence of enslaved Africans who brought their own culinary knowledge and did most of the actual cooking. The southern climate allowed for longer growing seasons and different crops than could thrive farther north, including rice in the low country of South Carolina and Georgia, which became as important to southern identity and economy as wheat was to the middle colonies. Rice cultivation was brutally difficult work, requiring the flooding and draining of fields, constant labor in swampy conditions that bred malaria and other diseases, an expertise that West African slaves possessed and European colonists did not. The enslaved people who grew rice also knew how to cook it, and rice appeared at southern tables in ways unknown in other colonies, as a side dish, in pilafs, and in puddings both savory and sweet. Okra, a West African vegetable that enslaved people had brought with them, or that planters imported specifically because enslaved workers knew and valued, it appeared in southern gardens and cooking, particularly in gumbo and other stews, where its thickening properties were appreciated. The African influence on southern food extended far beyond specific ingredients to encompass cooking techniques, flavor profiles, and the basic structure of southern cuisine. Enslaved cooks adapted their traditional one-pot cooking methods to the ingredients available in America, creating dishes that combined African, Native American, and European elements into something new. The southern preference for frying foods, the use of hot peppers for seasoning, the cooking of greens with pot liquor, and the combination of sweet and savory flavors all showed African influence that would become fundamental to southern identity, though this debt was rarely acknowledged by white Southerners in 1776 or for long afterward. Black-eyed peas, brought from Africa, became a southern staple, cooked with salt pork and served with cornbread, providing protein and establishing a food tradition that would last for centuries. The sophisticated rice dishes of the Carolina Lowcountry, the complex stews and ragouts that appeared on plantation tables, and even the barbecue traditions that were beginning to develop, all reflected the cooking knowledge and creativity of enslaved people who transformed raw ingredients into meals using techniques developed across generations in both Africa and America. The plantation system created extreme disparities in what different people ate in the South, with wealthy planters enjoying elaborate meals that rivaled anything available in England, while enslaved people subsisted on minimal rations supplemented by whatever they could grow, catch, or forage in their limited free time. A plantation owner's table might feature multiple meat dishes, refined white bread, imported wines and spirits, fresh vegetables from extensive gardens, and elaborate desserts, all prepared by enslaved cooks working in separate kitchen buildings to keep the heat and smells away from the main house. The enslaved people who prepared these elaborate meals ate cornmeal, salt, pork, and whatever vegetables they could grow in their own small plots, with meat being a rare luxury rather than a daily expectation. They kept chickens when possible, fished in rivers and streams, hunted small game when opportunity allowed, and foraged for wild foods to supplement inadequate rations. The skills they developed in making this limited and monotonous food supply palatable and nourishing laid groundwork for foodways that would profoundly shape American cuisine, though the credit would be slow in coming, and the conditions under which these innovations occurred were horrific. Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake colonies, developed a food culture distinct from both the Deep South and the North, shaped by tobacco agriculture and the aspiration of planters to recreate English gentry life in America. The Chesapeake planters imported English cookbooks, tried to grow English vegetables, and attempted to maintain English meal structures and dining customs even as they adapted to American ingredients and circumstances. Ham became a Chesapeake specialty, with Virginia hams in particular gaining fame for their quality. Produced from hogs that roamed the forests, eating acorns and hickory nuts that flavored the meat, the Chesapeake's many rivers and the bay itself provided extraordinary seafood, including oysters, crabs, and fish that appeared on tables from the wealthiest to the poorest, making seafood far more democratic than meat from land animals. The region's moderate climate allowed for more successful vegetable gardening than in either the Deep South or New England, and Chesapeake gardens produced cabbages, peas, beans, squash, and root vegetables in abundance. The food culture reflected the tension between English identity and American reality between the planters, pretensions to gentility, and the rough frontier conditions that still prevailed in many areas between the wealth of the plantation elite and the poverty of small farmers and the enslaved. The backcountry and frontier regions, stretching from the Georgia Piedmont through the Appalachian valleys to the northern frontier in Maine and New Hampshire, shared a food culture despite their geographic separation because they faced similar conditions of isolation, limited trade, and subsistence farming. Frontier families depended heavily on hunting and foraging to supplement what they could grow in small cleared fields hacked from the forest, making wild game a larger part of their diet than it was for more settled colonists. Corn was the dominant crop on the frontier because it grew well in new ground, could be cultivated with minimal equipment, and provided both food and livestock feed, making it essential to frontier survival. Pigs thrived on the frontier because they could forage in the woods with minimal supervision, making pork the most available domestic meat, even as wild game supplemented it. The frontier diet was monotonous and sometimes precarious, depending heavily on successful hunting, corn harvests, and the ability to preserve food for winter months when hunting was harder and stored food had to suffice. Frontier cooking methods were simpler than in more settled regions, as frontier families often lacked the equipment and ingredients for elaborate preparation. One-pot cooking dominated, with stews and porridges that combined whatever ingredients were available into filling, if not particularly varied meals. Bread was usually cornbread or johnnycakes, rather than wheat bread, as wheat was harder to grow and mill in frontier conditions. Whiskey production was beginning to develop on the frontier by 1776, as farmers discovered that grain was easier to transport to market in liquid form, and that whiskey provided a valuable trade good, as well as a product for home consumption. The frontier food culture was developing regional variations that would later become important American food traditions, including the barbecue culture of the southern backcountry, and the whiskey culture of the Appalachian region, but in 1776 these were still emerging rather than established. The frontier experience, with its self-reliance, make-do spirit, and adaptation to local conditions, represented in many ways the most distinctly American food culture, least bound to European traditions, and most shaped by the demands and opportunities of the American landscape. Segment 4. The Meat-Heavy Colonial Diet expanded. Americans in 1776 consumed astonishing quantities of meat by modern standards, with some estimates suggesting colonists ate nearly twice as much meat per capita as their European counterparts, and far more than most modern Americans consume, creating a diet that was protein-rich to a degree that seems almost excessive by contemporary nutritional understanding. Pork was king of the colonial table, as hogs required minimal care, could forage in forests for acorns, chestnuts, and roots, and provided meat that preserved beautifully through salting, smoking, and pickling, making them the ideal livestock for colonists who had extensive forests but limited time for animal husbandry. Every fall, families slaughtered hogs in elaborate affairs that produced hams, bacon, sausages, lard, and head cheese, with virtually every part of the animal utilized according to the principle that nothing should be wasted from a creature that would feed the family through the winter. Beef appeared less frequently on colonial tables than pork, as cattle were more valuable alive for their milk and their labor pulling plows and wagons, though wealthy colonists served it at special occasions, and beef did appear more regularly in prosperous middle colonies, where larger farms could support dedicated beef cattle. Wild game, including venison, rabbit, squirrel, and waterfowl, supplemented domestic meat, particularly on the frontier, where hunting remained essential to survival, and where men spent considerable time in the woods pursuing game both for food and for the valuable skins that could be sold or traded. Chicken was less common than modern Americans might expect, as hens were more valuable for their eggs than their meat, and they only ended up in the stew pot when they stopped laying or when a special occasion demanded it, making chicken soup a dish reserved for Sundays and celebrations, rather than everyday eating. The abundance of meat in the colonial American diet reflected the vast forests and relatively small population, creating a situation where land was abundant and labor was scarce, the opposite of the European condition, where every acre had long since been claimed and cleared. In Europe, meat was a luxury that common people ate sparingly, if at all, with peasants subsisting primarily on bread, porridge, and vegetables, while their landlords enjoyed roasted meats and game. In America, even relatively poor colonists could keep a few pigs that foraged in the woods, hunt for deer in forests that stretched for hundreds of miles, and fish in streams that teemed with life-making meat, accessible in ways that shocked European visitors. This abundance was not distributed equally across all regions and all classes, as we've seen. But even enslaved people and indentured servants in America often ate more meat than European peasants, though the quality and cuts varied dramatically. The environmental conditions that made this meat abundance possible were temporary, depending on old-growth forests, full of mast-producing trees, and game populations that had not yet been decimated by overhunting. But in 1776, those conditions still prevailed across much of colonial America. Pork's dominance in the colonial diet stemmed from the pig's remarkable suitability to colonial conditions and the excellent keeping qualities of preserved pork products. Hogs could survive and thrive in the forest with minimal human intervention, rooting for acorns, chestnuts, roots, and grubs that they converted into fat and meat without requiring the cultivated feed that cattle, sheep, and goats demanded. Colonists would mark their hogs' ears with distinctive cuts and release them into the woods to forage, rounding them up in the fall when they had fattened on the autumn mast for slaughter. The hog slaughter or hog killing time was a major event in the colonial calendar, typically occurring after the first hard frost when cold weather would help preserve the meat, and it required the labor of the entire family, plus often neighbors who would help with the expectation of reciprocal assistance when their own hog killing time came. The process began with shooting or stunning the hog, bleeding it, scalding the carcass in boiling water to loosen the hair, scraping it clean, and then butchering it into the various cuts that would be preserved through different methods. Nothing was wasted from the animal, with even the blood being saved for blood sausage, the intestines cleaned for sausage casings, the head boiled down for head cheese, and the fat rendered into lard that would be used for cooking throughout the year. The preservation of pork took several forms, each producing distinct products with different flavors and uses. Hams and shoulders were dry cured with salt and sometimes sugar, then smoked over hardwood fires that added flavor and further preservation, creating the Virginia hams and other regional specialties that could hang in the rafters for months or even years, improving in flavor as they aged. Bacon was cured pork belly, salted and smoked until the fat was rendered and the meat could be sliced thin and fried, providing flavoring for beans, greens, and other dishes as well as being eaten on its own. Salt pork was the most basic preservation method, simply packing pork in barrels filled with brine, creating meat that was extremely salty and needed soaking before cooking, but that could last for years and provided crucial protein for sailors, soldiers, and families whose other preservation methods had failed. Sausages were made from scraps and less desirable cuts, ground or chopped fine and mixed with fat, salt, and spices, then stuffed into cleaned intestines and smoked or dried, creating preserved meat that added variety to the winter diet. Lard, rendered from pork fat, became the primary cooking fat for most colonists, used for frying, baking, and preserving, making it nearly as valuable as the meat itself. Beef, while less common than pork in most colonial households, carried prestige and appeared regularly on the tables of the wealthy, while poorer colonists might enjoy it only occasionally. Cattle required more care than pigs, needing pasture or hay rather than forest forage, and they represented significant capital investment that made families reluctant to slaughter them when they could instead use them for milk and labor. Oxen, castrated male cattle, pulled plows and wagons, and were only slaughtered when they became too old for work, at which point their meat was tough and required long, slow cooking to become palatable. Cows provided milk, butter, and cheese, making them more valuable alive than dead for most of the year, though a cow that stopped producing milk or became injured might be slaughtered for beef. Young steers and heifers provided the best beef, but raising cattle specifically for meat was a luxury that only prosperous farmers could afford. When beef did appear, it might be fresh, roasted, boiled, or made into stews, but like pork, it was also preserved through salting for winter consumption, creating salt beef or corned beef that was less prized than preserved pork but still valuable. The middle colonies, with their larger farms and greater prosperity, consumed more beef than other regions, and beef consumption marked social status in ways that pork, available to nearly everyone, did not. Wild game provided meat that was free for the taking if one had the skill to hunt and the time to spend in the woods, making it particularly important for frontier families and for supplementing domestic meat in more settled areas. Venison from white-tailed deer that were abundant in colonial America appeared frequently on tables from the wealthiest to the poorest, as deer could be hunted in every colony and their meat was prized for its flavor and leanness. A single deer provided a substantial amount of meat that could be roasted fresh, made into stews and pies, or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying into jerky for long-term storage. Deer hunting required skill in tracking, shooting, and field dressing the animal, skills that frontiermen particularly prided themselves on, though indigenous hunting techniques and knowledge often proved superior to European methods. Smaller game, including rabbits, squirrels, and raccoons, appeared in stews and meat pies, particularly in poorer households where any source of protein was welcome, and where the time required to hunt small game was justified by the need, rather than being a sport or recreation. And coastal colonists developed elaborate techniques for hunting them, including punt guns, massive shotguns mounted on small boats that could kill dozens of birds with a single shot. The meat from these hunts was sometimes consumed fresh, but was also preserved through salting or potting, covered with rendered fat to exclude air and prevent spoilage, creating preserved game that could last for months. With some accounts describing them as nuisance birds that were fed to pigs when they appeared in overwhelming numbers. The attitude toward wild game in 1776 was one of abundance bordering on inexhaustibility, and colonists hunted without the conservation concerns that would later become necessary as game populations declined under hunting pressure and habitat loss. The hunting itself was seen as part of colonial masculinity, with skill in shooting and woodcraft marking a man as capable and self-reliant in ways that were valued in frontier culture. Chicken appeared on colonial tables less frequently than one might expect, given its ubiquity in modern American diets, as chickens were valued primarily for eggs rather than meat until they stopped laying. Hens laid eggs through spring and summer, production slowing or stopping in winter when daylight hours shortened and food was scarcer, making eggs a seasonal treat rather than a year-round staple in many households. A chicken in the stew pot meant the loss of future eggs, so families typically only culled chickens when they stopped laying, when the flock had grown too large to feed through winter, or when a special occasion like a Sunday dinner or a minister's visit justified the sacrifice. Roosters, which didn't lay eggs but were needed to maintain the flock, might be culled more readily once their reproductive duties were fulfilled. Chicken stew or chicken soup made from an old laying hen required long, slow cooking to tenderize the tough meat, but it created rich broth and a dish that was associated with comfort and celebration. The relative scarcity of chicken meat made it more special than it seems to us today, when chicken is among the cheapest meats available, a complete reversal from colonial times. Other domestic animals contributed meat less frequently, but still played roles in the colonial diet depending on region and circumstance. Sheep were kept primarily for wool, and mutton appeared mainly when sheep were culled from the flock for age or infirmity, making it less common than beef or pork, and sometimes regarded as inferior in flavor, though lamb from young sheep was prized when available. Goats were less common in colonial America than in Europe or other parts of the world, though some families kept them for milk and occasionally for meat, particularly in areas where cattle struggled. The ethnic and cultural diversity of the colonies meant that different groups had different attitudes toward which animals were appropriate to eat. But the dominant English culture that shaped colonial foodways generally limited meat consumption to the animals we've discussed. The preparation of meat in colonial kitchens reflected both the preservation methods that made meat available year-round and the cooking techniques that open hearth cooking demanded. Fresh meat was often roasted on spits before the fire. Boiling meat in iron pots created stews, pottages, and one-pot meals that combined meat with vegetables and sometimes grains, making the meat stretch farther and creating dishes that could feed large families from relatively small amounts of meat. Preserved meats required soaking to remove excess salt before cooking, and they contributed intense, salty flavor to dishes rather than being eaten on their own as fresh meat might be. And the difficulty of judging internal temperature without thermometers led to thorough cooking that prioritized safety over achieving perfect medium-rare temperatures. The meat-heavy colonial diet had consequences for health and society that colonists themselves rarely considered. The high protein intake supported the physical labor that dominated most people's lives, providing the calories and nutrients needed for farming, forestry, fishing, and other demanding work. However, the diet was unbalanced in ways that occasionally caused deficiency diseases, particularly scurvy during late winter when preserved meat dominated and fresh vegetables were unavailable, though colonists didn't understand the vitamin deficiencies that caused these ailments. By 1776, the meat abundance that characterized colonial life was at its peak, supported by environmental conditions that couldn't last as population grew and land use intensified, though colonists had no sense that the abundance might not continue forever. Segment 5. Fish, oysters, and coastal abundance expanded for coastal colonists in 1776. The sea and waterways provided an almost overwhelming abundance of fish and shellfish that is difficult to imagine today, after centuries of commercial exploitation have depleted stocks that once seemed inexhaustible. Often fed to servants and enslaved people, rather than appearing on genteel tables, a complete reversal from their modern status as a luxury item. Atlantic cod, the fish that had drawn European fishermen to American waters for centuries before permanent English settlement, appeared dried and salted in New England. Kitchens throughout the year soaked overnight to rehydrate and remove excess salt, then prepared in countless ways, from fish cakes mixed with potato to chowders enriched with salt, pork, and milk. Salmon ran so thick in northeastern rivers during their spawning season that fishing them required minimal skill or equipment, with fish being caught by the hundreds and sometimes the thousands, leading to the probably apocryphal but revealing stories of indentured servants' contracts, including clauses limiting how often they could be served. Salmon, as eating it more than a few times per week was considered cruel and unusual punishment. Shad, herring, and eels were caught in massive quantities during their spawning runs when they moved from the ocean into rivers and streams, either consumed fresh during the brief weeks when they were available, or preserved through salting, smoking, or pickling for consumption throughout the rest of the year. The lower quality fish, darker in flesh or broken in processing, went to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people on sugar plantations, creating a direct connection between New England fishing and Caribbean slavery. The worst quality fish and the scraps from processing were kept for local consumption or sold cheaply to poor colonists. creating a tiered market where the same species served completely different social functions depending on quality. The profits from cod fishing supported New England's economy and created the capital that merchants invested in shipbuilding, rum distilling, and other industries, making cod a foundation of New England prosperity, even as it was daily food that appeared on tables in forms that we would find almost inedible. The preparation and consumption of salt cod required knowledge and patience, as the preservation process left it extremely salty and tough as leather, requiring overnight soaking with multiple water changes to make it palatable, but acceptable when served with butter, cream sauces, or mixed with other ingredients to add flavor and texture. Fish cakes combined flaked salt cod with mashed potato, onions, and sometimes eggs, formed into patties and fried in lard, creating a dish that transformed preserved fish into something genuinely appealing, and that became a New England staple. Chowder, perhaps the most famous colonial fish dish, combined salt cod or fresh fish with salt pork diced and fried to render its fat, onions cooked in that fat, potatoes or broken ship's biscuit for bulk, and milk or cream to create a rich, thick stew that was satisfying and economical. The word chowder itself came from the French chaudière, meaning cauldron, reflecting the French fishing presence in North American waters and the cultural exchange that occurred in coastal regions where different European groups encountered each other. Striped bass, bluefish, flounder, and numerous other species were caught by commercial fishermen and by colonists fishing for their own consumption, providing fresh protein that was prized for its flavor compared to the ubiquitous salt cod. The problem with fresh fish was preservation, as it spoiled quickly in an era without refrigeration, meaning it had to be consumed within a day or two of catching, or be preserved through salting or smoking. Shad runs in spring represented annual events that brought fresh fish to the tables of rich and poor alike, as these large, bony fish migrated from the ocean into rivers in such numbers that they could be caught with minimal equipment. The shad themselves were eaten fresh, baked or planked beside the fire, and their roe was considered a particular delicacy, though the numerous small bones made eating shad a careful process that required attention to avoid choking. Herring runs similarly brought masses of small fish into rivers and streams, where they could be netted in enormous quantities and either eaten fresh or preserved through salting for winter consumption. Eels, which colonial Americans ate enthusiastically, though modern Americans generally find them unappetizing, were caught in eel weirs or trapped in baskets, and they were eaten fresh, smoked, or pickled in vinegar and spices. The seasonal nature of these fish runs meant that spring brought a glut of fresh fish that had to be consumed quickly or preserved, and families who lived near productive fishing spots could secure significant portions of their annual protein needs during the few weeks when fish were running. Shellfish beyond oysters contributed to coastal diets in ways that reflected both abundance and social stratification. Clams were dug from mudflats at low tide and eaten steamed, baked, or made into chowders, providing free food for anyone willing to spend time digging in the mud. Mussels attached to rocks in the intertidal zone were similarly available for the taking, though they were less prized than clams, and sometimes viewed with suspicion as they could occasionally accumulate toxins that made consumers ill. Crabs, particularly blue crabs in the Chesapeake region, were caught in large numbers and eaten boiled, picked for their meat, or made into crab cakes and other preparations, though, like lobster, they were so abundant that they didn't carry the prestige they would later acquire. Because they were cheap and abundant, and those who disdained them for exactly those reasons. The oyster deserves special attention because of its extraordinary abundance and its role in coastal economies and diets. And individual oysters grew to sizes rarely seen today, with some shells measuring more than a foot long. They were consumed raw by those with access to very fresh oysters, roasted in their shells over coals, fried, made into stews, baked into pies, and pickled for preservation and transport inland. Oyster cellars in coastal towns provided cheap food to working people, and oyster cellars became social gathering places where oysters were consumed with bread and beer. The export of pickled oysters allowed inland colonists to access this coastal abundance, and barrels of pickled oysters traveled surprising distances into the interior, where they provided variety in the diet and a taste of the coast. The fish and shellfish abundance that coastal colonists experienced in 1776 rested on ecosystems that were still largely intact. Despite more than 150 years of European fishing and harvesting, the populations of fish and shellfish seemed inexhaustible because they were continually replenished by productive ecosystems that had not yet been fundamentally altered by human activity. Coastal marshes and estuaries provided nursery habitat for fish species, oyster reefs, filtered water, and provided structure for complex food webs, and the relatively small human population meant that harvest pressure had not yet exceeded the ability of populations to replace themselves. This would change dramatically in the centuries to come as commercial fishing intensified, coastal development destroyed habitat, and pollution degraded water quality. But in 1776, the abundance seemed permanent, and colonists had no sense that their harvest of marine resources could be unsustainable. The maritime bounty shaped colonial culture in ways that extended beyond simple nutrition, creating occupations, supporting trade, and influencing settlement patterns. Fishing communities developed along the coast, with economies built entirely around catching, processing, and selling fish and shellfish. And accidents, creating a culture that was both resilient and fatalistic about the ocean's power. The wealth generated by fishing, particularly the cod trade, supported the development of New England towns. For colonists living away from the coast, fish remained important, but took different forms, arriving as preserved products rather than fresh catches. Pickled oysters and other preserved shellfish similarly moved inland, creating markets for coastal products and connecting regions through trade. The Continental Army would depend on salt fish to feed its soldiers, as preserved fish could travel with the army and did not require the constant supply of fodder that would have been necessary to support equivalent protein from livestock. The cod that New England fishermen caught and the oysters that Chesapeake watermen harvested would thus contribute not just to colonial diets, but to the ability of colonists to sustain a military force during the Revolution, making the maritime bounty part of the foundation of American independence, even if it is less celebrated than the farms and forests that also supported the revolutionary cause. Segment 6. The Forgotten Vegetables expanded the vegetable selection in 1776 would seem limited and strange to modern Americans accustomed to year-round produce from around the world, with supermarket shelves offering strawberries in December, asparagus in March, and tomatoes every day of the year regardless of season or climate. Root vegetables dominated the colonial palate, as they stored well in root cellars and provided sustenance through the winter months when fresh food was scarce and the frozen ground made harvesting anything else impossible. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and especially potatoes, which had only recently been widely accepted by British colonists after centuries of European suspicion, appeared regularly in stews, roasted alongside meats, or mashed with butter when that precious commodity was available. and valued for its ability to prevent scurvy on long voyages or during lean months when other vegetables were unavailable. Peas and beans, both fresh and dried, provided protein and variety, often cooked with salt pork into thick pottages that could simmer over the fire all day and feed a family for multiple meals. Greens like lettuce, spinach, and various wild plants appeared in spring and summer, often boiled until quite soft by modern standards, in the belief that raw vegetables were unhealthy and that thorough cooking made them safer and more digestible. Tomatoes existed in gardens but were largely ornamental, as many colonists believed them poisonous due to their relationship to deadly nightshade. And the vegetables they did eat often came in varieties that have since disappeared or been replaced by modern cultivars bred for different qualities. The carrots of 1776 were smaller, tougher, and often purple, white, or yellow rather than the uniform orange we expect today, and they required longer cooking to become tender enough to eat. Lettuce came in loose-leaf varieties rather than the tight heads we're familiar with, and it was considered a warm-weather crop to be eaten fresh, rather than something to be harvested and stored. Onions were essential to colonial cooking, appearing in nearly every savory dish and valued both for their flavor and their keeping qualities, as braided onions could hang in a cool place for months without spoiling. Garlic was less common in English colonial cooking than onions, though German and other continental European settlers used it more freely, and the different ethnic groups' approaches to vegetables and seasonings created regional variation that would eventually blend into American cuisine. Root vegetables earned their dominance in the colonial diet through their remarkable ability to survive storage in root cellars, underground spaces, or above-ground buildings where the earth's insulation kept temperatures cool but not freezing through the winter months. Potatoes, despite having originated in South America and having only entered European cultivation in the 16th century, had become crucial to colonial diets by 1776. Because they produced abundant calories from relatively small garden spaces and kept well when stored properly. The potatoes themselves were smaller than modern varieties and came in different colors, including purple and blue-fleshed varieties. And they were prepared by boiling, roasting in the ashes, or occasionally mashing, though this last preparation required dairy products that weren't always available. Colonists had initially resisted potatoes because of their association with poverty in Europe and confusion about which part of the plant to eat, with some early colonial attempts at potato cultivation failing because settlers tried to eat the poisonous fruits rather than the tubers. Though they were still less central to the diet than they were in Ireland, where potato dependence would soon lead to catastrophe when disease struck the crop. And they served both as human food and as winter fodder for livestock that helped keep animals alive when pasture was frozen and hay was running low. Parsnips, sweet and nutty when cooked, were often roasted alongside meat or boiled and mashed, and they had the advantage of actually improving in flavor after frost touched them, making them one of the last vegetables harvested in fall. Colonial cooks used parsnips in ways we've largely forgotten, including in sweet preparations where their natural sugars were emphasized, creating dishes that fell between modern concepts of vegetable sides and desserts. Carrots served similar purposes to parsnips, but were perhaps even more versatile, appearing in stews, roasted as sides, and occasionally in sweet preparations, though the modern association of carrots with sweetness hadn't yet fully developed. Fresh cabbage appeared throughout summer and fall, eaten raw in slaws dressed with vinegar, boiled until soft with salt pork for flavoring, or incorporated into soups and stews. The real importance of cabbage emerged in its preserved form as sauerkraut, particularly in German communities where the fermentation technique had been perfected over generations. Properly made sauerkraut could last for years, and it retained vitamin C even in preserved form, making it crucial for preventing scurvy during winters when fresh food was unavailable. The sauerkraut making process was labor-intensive, requiring the harvesting and shredding of enormous quantities of cabbage. In the brief window of time between when heads were mature and when hard frost would damage them, creating a frantic period of work in late fall, similar to hog-killing time. English colonists generally made less sauerkraut than their German neighbors, but had their own methods of preserving cabbage through pickling in vinegar-based brines that created different flavors but similar keeping qualities. Peas occupied a special place in the colonial vegetable garden because they could be eaten fresh or dried. Came in both garden peas The famous peas porridge or peas pudding was made from dried split peas cooked with salt pork or bacon until they broke down into a thick, mushy consistency that could be eaten hot from the pot or allowed to cool and solidify, then sliced and fried for another meal. And lima beans, among others, each with slightly different flavors and cooking properties. The combination of beans or peas with salt pork appeared so frequently in colonial meals that it represented a culinary building block around which many other dishes were structured. Cultivated lettuce was eaten fresh in salads dressed with vinegar and oil when these ingredients were available, providing refreshment during hot summer months when heavy stews seemed less appealing. Wild greens, including dandelion leaves, lamb's quarters, purslane, and numerous others, were gathered in early spring when they were tender and mild, providing essential nutrients after a winter of preserved foods that lacked vitamins. And potentially harmful, making salads less common than they would later become. The suspicion of tomatoes in 1776 represents one of the more curious aspects of colonial vegetable culture, as tomatoes were being grown in gardens but not generally eaten because of fears about their toxicity. The tomato plant's membership in the nightshade family, which includes several poisonous species, had created association with poison in European minds, and while tomatoes were eaten in southern Europe and had been adopted in Caribbean and southern colonial cooking influenced by Spanish traditions, they remained suspect in English colonial culture. The wealthy occasionally grew tomatoes as ornamental plants, appreciating their colorful fruits without considering eating them, while the knowledge that tomatoes were actually edible existed in scattered pockets but hadn't yet spread widely. But in revolutionary America, they remained largely ornamental or were eaten only by the adventurous. Other vegetables appeared in colonial gardens with varying frequency depending on region and ethnic background. Radishes appeared in early spring as one of the first crops to mature, providing fresh, peppery flavor after months without herbs, including parsley, sage, thyme, and others, were cultivated in kitchen gardens to flavor the often bland preserved foods, and their cultivation was considered essential to good cooking. Celery existed, but was less common than it would later become, and it was often blanched by piling earth around the stems to keep them white and tender, a labor-intensive process that limited its cultivation. In 1776, vegetables appeared in succession as the growing season progressed, starting with early spring greens and radishes. And anticipation, summer bringing abundant variety and the hard work of preserving, fall offering the harvest bounty that would determine winter survival. The arrival of each new vegetable was an event to be celebrated, marking the passage of seasons and providing variety after weeks or months of eating whatever came before. Colonial cooks generally boiled vegetables for long periods until they were quite soft, following culinary traditions that valued thorough cooking. The vegetable garden itself was typically maintained by women, who were responsible for the daily work of planting, weeding, harvesting, and preserving that kept the household supplied with vegetables throughout the year. The kitchen garden was distinct from the main fields where grain and other crops were grown. Located close to the house where it could be easily accessed and protected from livestock and wild animals, the garden was often enclosed by fences to keep out chickens, pigs, and deer that would otherwise destroy the crops. And it received more intensive care than the field crops, including regular watering during dry periods, careful weeding, and the addition of manure or other fertilizers to maintain soil fertility. Seeds were saved from year to year, with the best specimens of each vegetable being allowed to go to seed, so that the next year's garden could be planted, creating locally adapted varieties that performed well in specific conditions. The exchange of seeds between neighbors and family members created networks of seed sharing that helped maintain diversity and introduced new varieties. Though the vast majority of seeds came from plants that had been growing in colonial gardens for generations, the class divisions that characterized meat consumption also appeared in vegetable consumption, though perhaps less dramatically. Wealthy families had larger gardens maintained by servants or enslaved people, allowing for greater variety and abundance of fresh vegetables during the growing season. They might also have access to exotic vegetables or fruits through trade networks, including items like artichokes, cauliflower, or asparagus that were expensive and difficult to grow, but that signaled status and sophistication. Poor families had smaller gardens and less variety, focusing on vegetables that produced abundantly with minimal care and that stored well, making their diet more monotonous, though not necessarily less nutritious. The vegetables that wealthy families preserved might include more expensive items pickled in vinegar with imported spices, while poor families preserved vegetables would be simpler sauerkraut and root vegetables in cellars. Enslaved people often maintained their own small garden plots where they grew vegetables to supplement inadequate rations, and these gardens sometimes included African vegetables like okra that didn't appear in white colonists. Gardens creating parallel food cultures that would eventually influence each other. The forgotten vegetables of 1776 remind us how dramatically food culture can change in just a few centuries, as items that were once daily staples have become obscure, while foods that were unknown or distrusted have become central to our diets. The parsnips and turnips that filled colonial root cellars have largely disappeared from American tables, replaced by potatoes that have become so dominant we forget they were once new and suspect. The sauerkraut that kept colonists healthy through winter has become a specialty item rather than a household staple, except in communities that maintain German culinary traditions. The wild greens that colonists foraged each spring are now rarely gathered, except by dedicated foragers or those maintaining older traditions. The tomatoes that colonists feared have become so central to American cuisine that we can barely imagine cooking without them. These transformations in vegetable culture reflect broader changes in American agriculture, food processing, transportation, and global trade that have completely reorganized what appears on American tables and when it arrives there, making the vegetable culture of 1776 seem as foreign as the vegetables themselves. Segment 7. Bread. The staff of life expanded bread held sacred importance in the colonial diet, though it looked and tasted quite different from the fluffy white loaves we know today. And the phrase staff of life reflected genuine dependence on bread as the foundation of daily eating rather than being merely a poetic expression. Cornbread, made from ground cornmeal, appeared far more frequently than wheat bread, particularly among poorer colonists and in regions where wheat struggled to grow due to climate, soil conditions, or plant diseases that regularly devastated wheat crops. Johnnycakes, thin cornmeal pancakes, cooked on a griddle or hearthstone, served as portable food for travelers and soldiers, able to be carried in saddlebags or pockets and eaten cold throughout the day, without spoiling, making them ideal for people who worked away from home or who were on the move. Rye bread, dark and dense with a distinctive sour flavor, that came from natural fermentation, and the grain itself filled the gap in northern colonies where wheat harvests were unreliable due to a wheat disease called blast or wheat rust that turned kernels black and made the grain unusable. Wheat bread, when available, was a mark of status and prosperity, though even wealthy colonists ate bread that would seem coarse and heavy today, made from less refined flour than modern milling produces, retaining more of the bran and germ that gave it darker color, denser texture, and more complex flavor. Biscuits in the British sense of hard crackers rather than fluffy southern biscuits that wouldn't become common until later, could last for months without spoiling and became standard provisions for sailors and soldiers who needed food that could withstand long storage in difficult conditions. Women spent hours each week grinding grain, maintaining sourdough starters, kneading dough, and baking in unpredictable hearth ovens, making bread production one of the most time-consuming household tasks and one that required significant skill to produce consistent results. The importance of bread in the diet made grain shortages and flour price increases matters of serious concern, sometimes sparking protests and riots in colonial cities when the poor found themselves unable to afford basic sustenance, and governments occasionally intervened to regulate grain prices or bread weights to prevent civil unrest. The various types of bread consumed in colonial America reflected both the grains that could be successfully grown in different regions and the ethnic backgrounds of the people who settled each area, creating regional bread cultures that remained distinct. Well into the 19th century, cornbread came in numerous variations depending on region and whether the cook had access to wheat flour, eggs, milk, or other enriching ingredients beyond the basic cornmeal, water, and salt. Southern cornbread was often made with just cornmeal water or buttermilk and salt, baked in a cast iron skillet that had been heated in the fire until it was nearly smoking, creating a crispy crust on the outside while the interior remained moist. Northern cornbread sometimes incorporated wheat flour if available, creating a lighter texture than pure cornbread and demonstrating the class distinctions that even different types of cornbread could signal. Corn pone, corn dodgers, and hoe cakes were all variations on cornbread with slight differences in proportions, cooking methods, or regional naming conventions, but they all served the same basic purpose of transforming cornmeal into filling, portable bread. Johnny cakes deserve special attention because they represent perhaps the most purely American bread, having no real European equivalent and being instead an adaptation of Native American cooking methods to colonial needs and tastes. The basic recipe was extremely simple: cornmeal mixed with boiling water or milk and a bit of salt, shaped into flat cakes and cooked on a griddle or flat stone until crispy on the outside. The name itself is disputed, with some arguing it comes from journey cakes because they were ideal for travel, others claiming it derives from Shawnee cakes after the Native American people, and still others suggesting Johnny was a corruption of some other word entirely. Rhode Islanders claimed their Johnny cakes were the authentic version and insisted on specific types of white-cap flint corn, ground in specific ways to produce the proper texture and flavor, demonstrating the regional pride and specificity that could develop around even simple foods. The beauty of Johnny cakes was their simplicity and versatility, requiring only cornmeal, water, and heat to produce edible bread, making them accessible even to the poorest families and most isolated frontier settlements. Rye bread became dominant in New England not by choice but by necessity, as wheat proved difficult to grow successfully in the region's climate and soil. The same wheat blast or rust that made wheat cultivation unreliable left rye largely unaffected, making rye the reliable grain even in years when wheat failed completely. Rye bread was made from rye flour that was ground from rye grain, mixed with water and salt, and leavened with sourdough starter, since rye did rise as well with other leavening methods available at the time. The resulting bread was dark, dense, and had a sour, slightly bitter flavor that took some getting used to for those raised on wheat bread. But New Englanders learned to appreciate it, and it became fundamental to regional identity. German settlers brought their own rye bread traditions, creating breads that were even darker and denser than English colonial rye bread, sometimes incorporating wheat flour when available to create mixed grain breads that combined rye's reliability with wheat's superior baking properties. The sourdough starters used to leaven rye bread were carefully maintained, passed down through generations, and treated almost as family heirlooms, since a good starter was essential to producing edible bread. Wheat bread represented the ideal that colonists aspired to, the bread they remembered from England or imagined in their idealized visions of genteel living. But it remained elusive for many colonists throughout their lives. The Middle Colony's success with wheat cultivation made them the breadbasket of colonial America, and wheat flour from Pennsylvania and New York was shipped to other colonies where it was expensive but available for those who could afford it. Wheat bread came in different grades depending on how thoroughly the flour was sifted and refined, with the finest white bread made from flour that had been bolted through fine cloth multiple times to remove all bran and create pure white flour. This white bread was light, fine-textured, and utterly unlike the whole-grain breads that most colonists ate, making it a luxury that signaled wealth and status when it appeared on the table. Even among wheat breads there were distinctions, with mentioned bread, made from the finest flour, being reserved for the upper classes, while coarser wheat bread, made from less refined flour, served the middling sorts. Brown bread, made from wheat flour that retained more of the bran, was nutritionally superior to white bread, though this wasn't understood at the time, and it was what most colonists ate when they ate wheat bread at all. The process of making bread in colonial kitchens was labor-intensive and required both physical strength and considerable skill to produce consistent results. Grain had to be ground into flour, either at home using a hand mill or quern, or taken to a commercial mill where the miller would grind it for a portion of the flour or a fee. Home grinding was exhausting work, requiring hours of turning a heavy millstone to grind enough flour for a week's baking, and it produced coarser flour than commercial mills could achieve with their water-powered or wind-powered equipment. The flour then had to be sifted to remove the coarsest bran and any remaining hulls, creating another labor-intensive step that determined the final quality of the bread. Leaven had to be prepared, either by maintaining a sourdough starter that was fed regularly with fresh flour and water, or by using barm from beer brewing, or later by using purchased yeast when it became available. The dough itself required extensive kneading to develop the gluten that would give the bread structure. And this kneading was hard physical work that left bakers with strong arms and tired muscles. Baking bread in a hearth oven was an art form that required years of experience to master, as there was no temperature control beyond the baker's judgment and experience. The process began by building a fire inside the oven, using kindling and then larger pieces of wood to heat the brick or stone until it was thoroughly hot. The baker judged the temperature by holding her hand inside the oven and counting how long she could stand the heat, or by observing how quickly a piece of paper browned or how flour scattered on the floor of the oven behaved. When the temperature was right, the ashes and coals were swept out. The floor of the oven was wiped clean, and the loaves were placed inside, using a long-handled wooden peel. The door was then closed, sealing the oven so it would retain heat, and the bread baked in the falling temperature as the bricks slowly released their stored heat. The timing was crucial and depended on experience, as there was no way to check the bread without opening the oven and releasing precious heat. A skilled baker could produce beautiful, evenly baked loaves, while a less experienced one might end up with bread that was burnt on the bottom and raw in the middle, or that refused to rise properly. The communal aspects of bread baking created social structures and obligations that bound communities together, particularly in towns where commercial bakers operated. In cities and larger towns, professional bakers produced bread for sale, operating large ovens that could bake many loaves at once and selling bread to households that lacked baking facilities or whose women lacked time for baking. These commercial bakers were regulated by local governments that set the size of bread, determining how much bread, of what quality, should be sold for a given price, with inspectors checking weight and quality to prevent cheating. Home bakers sometimes shared ovens, with neighbors taking turns heating the oven and baking their bread in succession to conserve fuel and labor. In rural areas where each household baked its own bread, women might share sourdough starters, exchange recipes and techniques, and help each other during particularly demanding periods like harvest time, when bread consumption increased dramatically to feed extra workers. Ship's biscuit or hardtack represented the opposite extreme from soft, fresh bread, being deliberately made to be as hard and dry as possible so it could last for months or years without spoiling. These crackers were made from flour, water, and salt, mixed into a stiff dough, rolled thin, cut into squares or circles, and baked multiple times until they were completely dry and hard as wood. The result was nearly indestructible and virtually inedible without soaking in liquid, but it could be stored indefinitely and transported anywhere, making it essential for naval vessels, merchant ships, and military campaigns. Sailors and soldiers would soak ship's biscuit in their coffee, soup, or stew to soften it enough to eat, and they would sometimes break it apart to check for weevils and other insects that might have infested it during storage. The production of ship's biscuit was a major industry in port cities where naval and commercial vessels needed to stock their stores, and large bakeries devoted themselves entirely to producing these crackers in enormous quantities. The cultural and religious significance of bread extended beyond mere nutrition to encompass ideas about civilization, status, and proper living. Wheat bread in particular carried associations with civilization and refinement, representing the achievement of recreating European agricultural success in America and marking the eater as someone with the wealth and taste to afford the best. The Christian symbolism of bread as the body of Christ made it sacred in religious contexts, and the breaking of bread together created bonds of fellowship and community that were taken seriously. The offering of bread and salt to guests was a gesture of hospitality that signaled welcome and safety, creating obligations of guest friendship that were recognized across cultural boundaries. To be without bread was to be in desperate circumstances, and the poor who could not afford bread were truly destitute in ways that made them dependent on charity and public assistance. The differences in bread consumption between rich and poor highlighted class divisions in ways that were immediately visible and impossible to disguise. A wealthy family's table might feature fine white bread, sweetbreads, and cakes, and a variety of specialty breads that demonstrated both their prosperity and their cook's skill. A middling family would have good brown bread or mixed grain bread, showing respectability without extravagance. A poor family might have only coarse cornbread or rye bread, and in desperate times they might stretch their grain with additives like ground peas or beans that made the bread less palatable but more filling. Enslaved people often received only cornmeal for making their own bread and their cornbread. was made without the milk, eggs, or wheat flour that might enrich it, being instead the plainest possible bread that would keep them alive to work. The type of bread one ate was thus a marker of social status that everyone could observe, and that reinforced the hierarchies of colonial society with every meal. The bread consumed in 1776 was fundamentally different from modern bread, not just in its ingredients and preparation, but in its entire relationship to daily life and social structure. Modern bread is a commodity produced in factories, sliced uniformly, packaged in plastic, and purchased at stores where dozens of varieties compete for attention. Colonial bread was made at home or by known bakers, varied enormously in quality depending on the skill of the baker and the ingredients available, and represented hours of labor and significant portions of household budgets. Modern Americans take bread for granted, assuming it will always be available and giving little thought to where it comes from or how it's made. Colonial Americans understood bread as precious, as the product of months of agricultural labor and hours of domestic work, and as essential to survival in ways that made its availability or scarcity a matter of life and death. The transformation from one understanding of bread to the other represents a broader transformation in how Americans relate to food. From intimate knowledge of its production to alienation from those processes, from scarcity and insecurity to abundance and assumption, from bread as staff of life to bread as an afterthought. Segment 8. Beverages and liquid calories expanded. Americans in 1776 drank relatively little water, instead consuming astonishing quantities of alcohol and other beverages that would surprise modern health advocates who promote 8 glasses of water daily and warn of alcohol's dangers to health and productivity. Hard cider was the drink of everyday life for many colonists, consumed by men, women, and even children from morning to night, as apple orchards were common across the colonies and cider production was simple enough that nearly any household with access to apples could make it. Beer and ale brewed at home or in local taverns provided another staple beverage, typically weaker than modern beer, but consumed in much greater volume, with workers expecting to drink several quarts per day as part of their normal routine. Rum imported from the Caribbean or distilled in New England from molasses brought from sugar islands became particularly popular and played a crucial role in the triangular trade that connected America, Africa, and the West Indies in patterns of commerce that enriched colonists while enslaving Africans. Whiskey production was just beginning to take hold on the frontier, where farmers found it easier to transport grain in liquid form than as bulky bushels that required wagons and good roads, and where distilled spirits provided both a cash crop and a product for home consumption that required no refrigeration or special storage. Coffee and tea had become important in colonial culture by 1776, though the tea would soon face political complications that would make coffee the patriotic choice and help establish coffee rather than tea as America's dominant hot beverage. Milk was consumed fresh by farm families who had dairy cows, but it was dangerous to drink in cities where it spoiled quickly in warm weather and where adulteration with water, or worse, made it unreliable and sometimes deadly. The preference for alcohol over water was not mere indulgence, but reflected real concerns about water safety in an era before germ theory and proper sanitation, as colonists had observed that people who drank beer and cider stayed healthier than those who drank water from wells and streams that might be contaminated with human and animal waste. The production and consumption of hard cider represented a fundamental aspect of colonial life that has largely disappeared from modern American culture, except in small pockets where cider traditions have been maintained or recently revived. Every farm that could manage it maintained an apple orchard, not primarily for eating apples fresh, but for making cider that would provide drink for the entire year until the next harvest came around. The apples themselves were often varieties that were too bitter, sour, or otherwise unpalatable for fresh eating, but that made excellent cider with complex flavors and good alcohol content. The fall harvest saw apples being gathered in enormous quantities, loaded into carts, and taken to cider mills, where they were ground into pumice using heavy stone wheels turned by horses or water power. The pumice was then pressed in massive wooden presses that squeezed out the juice, which would begin fermenting almost immediately from wild yeasts present on the apple skins and in the air. The fresh pressed juice or sweet cider could be drunk immediately, but most of it was stored in barrels where it fermented over weeks into hard cider with alcohol content ranging from about 5 to 8%, depending on the apples and the fermentation conditions. Hard cider consumption in colonial America reached levels that seem almost unbelievable by modern standards, with some estimates suggesting that colonists consumed an average of 30 to 40 gallons per person per year, including children. A farm laborer might easily drink a quart of cider with breakfast, another quart during a mid-morning break, more with dinner and finish the day having consumed a gallon or more of alcoholic cider, without anyone considering this unusual or problematic. The cider itself was nutritious, in addition to being alcoholic, providing calories, vitamins and minerals that supplemented the diet, and its alcohol content was low enough that people could consume large quantities without becoming obviously intoxicated, though they were probably functioning in a state of mild constant inebriation that they considered normal. The social aspects of cider drinking created community bonds, with neighbors gathering for beers where they would help press cider and then celebrate with generous drinking, and with cider being offered to visitors as a gesture of hospitality that would be rude to refuse. Beer and ale occupied similar positions in colonial drinking culture, though they were more common in areas with German or Dutch settlement, where brewing traditions were strong, and in cities where commercial breweries operated. The distinction between beer and ale in colonial times was primarily about hopping, with beer being hopped and ale being unhopped or lightly hopped, creating different flavor profiles and different keeping qualities. Home brewing was the responsibility of women, who maintained the brewing equipment, managed the fermentation process, and ensured that the household had adequate supplies of beer for daily consumption. The process began with malting grain, usually barley, but sometimes wheat or other grains, by soaking it until it sprouted, and then drying it in a kiln to halt germination, creating malted grain with enzymes that could convert starches to fermentable sugars. The malted grain was crushed, mixed with hot water in a process called mashing that allowed the enzymes to work, and then the resulting sweet liquid or wort was boiled with hops if making beer, or without hops if making ale. After cooling, yeast was added, and the mixture was left to ferment for days or weeks, creating beer that could be consumed immediately or stored for later use. Small beer, with lower alcohol content than regular beer, was specifically brewed for daily consumption, including by children, while stronger beer was reserved for evening drinking and special occasions. The alcohol content of small beer was typically around 2 to 3%, roughly half that of modern beer, making it possible to drink large quantities without serious intoxication, though the cumulative effects of constant alcohol consumption were still significant. Beer provided calories and nutrients that made it more than just an intoxicant. Commercial breweries in larger towns and cities produced beer on a larger scale, selling it by the barrel to taverns and by the pitcher to customers who brought their own containers, and brewing became an important urban industry that supported both direct employment and the agriculture that produced the necessary grain and hops. New England imported molasses from Caribbean sugar plantations, distilled it into rum in coastal distilleries that filled the air with their distinctive smell, and then shipped that rum to Africa, where it was traded for enslaved people who were brought to the Caribbean to produce more sugar and molasses, completing the triangle. Rum consumption crossed all class boundaries, with wealthy colonists drinking fine imported rum from Jamaica or Barbados, while poorer colonists and sailors drank cheaper New England rum, but all of them participating in an economic system built on human suffering. The rituals around rum drinking created social occasions and demonstrated status through the quality and quantity of rum offered to guests and consumed at gatherings. Taverns served rum by the dram or mixed into punch bowls that patrons shared, creating convivial atmospheres where politics and business were discussed alongside social gossip. The importance of taverns in colonial life cannot be overstated, as they served as informal community centers where news was exchanged, deals were made, and the public life of the community was conducted, all lubricated by generous quantities of rum and beer. The tavern keeper occupied an important social position. providing a space for male sociability, while also being responsible for maintaining order and ensuring that drinking didn't become too disruptive. Women were generally excluded from tavern culture, except as tavern keepers themselves or as servers, creating a male-dominated drinking culture that reinforced gender hierarchies and provided men with spaces away from domestic life and female supervision. Whiskey's emergence on the frontier represented both economic logic and the adaptation of Scots-Irish distilling traditions to American conditions and ingredients. But it served its purpose of preserving the value of grain in transportable form and providing a strong drink for frontier consumption. Coffee was beginning its rise to American dominance in 1776, though it hadn't yet achieved the total victory over tea that would come after the revolution made tea drinking politically suspect. Coffee came from the Caribbean and South America, imported as green beans that had to be roasted before use, and it was expensive enough that many colonists couldn't afford it or consumed it only on special occasions. Those who did drink coffee roasted the beans themselves, ground them in hand mills and brewed coffee by boiling the grounds in water. The rise of coffeehouses in cities created male social spaces similar to taverns but with different atmospheres, as coffee drinking was associated with rational discourse and Enlightenment ideals rather than the rowdiness of rum-soaked taverns. The coffee itself was believed to have stimulating properties that promoted clear thinking, making it appropriate for business discussions and intellectual conversation in ways that alcohol-induced conviviality was not. Tea occupied a complex position in colonial culture by 1776, having been the dominant hot beverage of genteel society but becoming politically controversial as tensions with Britain escalated. And it was heavily taxed, making it expensive and creating incentives for smuggling. The ritual of tea drinking had become elaborate among wealthy colonists who imported tea services from England or China, prepared tea in specific ways that demonstrated their knowledge of proper form, and used tea drinking as an occasion for female sociability that paralleled the male sociability of taverns and coffeehouses. The political crisis that would culminate in the Boston Tea Party of 1773 had already begun by 1776, and many patriotic colonists had switched to coffee or to herbal infusions called liberté, tea made from local plants like raspberry leaves. Milk consumption in colonial America was complicated by the practical difficulties of keeping milk fresh in an era without refrigeration, making it primarily a farm product that was consumed fresh by those who had access to dairy cows or transformed into butter and cheese that could be stored. But it soured quickly in warm weather and had to be consumed within a day or two of milking. In cities, milk was sold by milkmen who brought it from nearby farms, but the quality was unreliable and adulteration was common, with sellers adding water to increase volume or even adding chalk or other substances to make watered milk appear richer. The dangers of contaminated milk were real, and many urban children died from drinking milk that carried diseases from sick cows or that had been contaminated during handling and transport. Chocolate as a beverage represented luxury and sophistication, consumed primarily by wealthy colonists who could afford the imported cacao and who had the equipment and knowledge to prepare it properly. Colonial chocolate was often spiced with cinnamon, vanilla, or even cayenne pepper, creating complex flavors that emphasized chocolate's exotic origins and its association with Spanish and Mesoamerican cultures. The health effects of constant low-level alcohol consumption are debated, but it's likely that many colonists functioned in a state of mild The social effects of alcohol consumption were significant, creating convivial atmospheres that strengthened community bonds, while also sometimes leading to violence, family disruption, and alcohol dependency that colonial society recognized, but didn't address systematically. And the drinks that sustained colonists through their daily lives were inseparable from the economic systems of slavery and trade that enriched some while oppressing others. Segment 9. Preservation and storage expanded. Survival through the winter depended entirely on how successfully colonists could preserve the summer's abundance. Salting was the primary method for preserving meat and fish, with pork packed in barrels of brine that saturated the meat with salt and created an environment where bacteria could ungrow. Smoking transformed fresh pork into bacon and ham, adding flavor while creating foods that could hang in the rafters for months without spoiling. The acidity of the vinegar preventing the growth of microorganisms that would otherwise cause spoilage. Drying worked for fruits, herbs, and some vegetables, with apple slices strung on threads and hung near the hearth where the warm, dry air gradually removed moisture, and beans left on the vine until they could be shelled and stored in sacks or barrels where they would remain edible for years. Root vegetables were packed in sand or sawdust in root cellars, where the cool earth kept them from freezing in winter, while the sand or sawdust prevented them from touching each other and spreading rot, creating storage conditions that could keep carrots, turnips, parsnips, and potatoes edible well into spring. Sugar preservation was expensive but effective, allowing wealthy families to enjoy preserved fruits in the form of jams, jellies, and candied peels that required large quantities of imported sugar, but that created products that could last indefinitely, and that demonstrated the family's prosperity. The rhythm of the seasons dictated not just what people ate, but when they worked, with late summer and fall being frantic periods of harvesting, preserving, and storing that would determine whether the family thrived or starved. Come February, when stored food was running low and spring planting was still months away, the techniques of salting meat and fish represented ancient preservation methods that had been refined over centuries and that colonists brought with them from Europe before adapting them to American conditions and ingredients. The execution was more complex, requiring the right amount of salt, proper temperatures, and careful attention to detail to ensure complete preservation without over-salting to the point of inedibility. Pork was typically salted in several ways depending on which cuts were being preserved and how long they needed to last, with hams and shoulders receiving dry salt cures that were rubbed directly into the meat before hanging to age, while bacon was sometimes dry cured and sometimes wet-cured in brine depending on regional traditions and family preferences. The process of dry curing a ham began immediately after the hog was slaughtered and butchered. While the meat was still fresh and before any decomposition could begin, the ham was rubbed thoroughly with a mixture of salt and sometimes sugar, with the sugar helping to offset the harshness of the salt and adding complexity to the final flavor. The salt drew out moisture that was allowed to drain away, and additional salt was added periodically to ensure complete coverage and penetration. And then hung in a smokehouse where it might be smoked with hardwood like hickory or oak, the smoke adding flavor and additional preservation. The smoking itself took days or weeks depending on the desired intensity, with the ham hanging in the cool smoke that slowly dried it further while depositing compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. The result was a ham that would last for months or even years, growing more complex in flavor as it aged, though it required soaking before cooking to remove excess salt. Smoking as a preservation method added complexity beyond mere preservation, creating flavors and textures that were valued in themselves rather than being merely tolerated as the price of extending shelf life. The smokehouse became an essential building on any farm that preserved significant quantities of meat, typically built as a small structure with a dirt floor where smoldering fires could be maintained, racks or hooks for hanging meat, and a roof with vents that allowed smoke to escape while maintaining the smoky atmosphere inside. The choice of wood for smoking mattered, with different woods imparting different flavors to the meat. Hickory created strong, assertive smoke flavor. Apple wood gave sweeter, The smoking process required maintaining low temperatures with steady smoke production over days or weeks, avoiding hot smoke that would cook the meat rather than preserving it, and ensuring even smoke exposure so all parts of the meat were properly treated. Bacon production combined salting and smoking to create one of the most important preserved meats in the colonial diet, with bacon appearing at breakfast flavoring vegetables and beans and serving as a portable food that could be carried by travelers or workers. The cured belly was then rinsed and hung in the smokehouse, where it was exposed to cool smoke for days. The smoking adding flavor and additional preservation, while creating the distinctive taste and aroma that made bacon so desirable. The finished bacon could be stored hanging in a cool place, or wrapped and kept in the cellar, and it would last for months while providing essential fat and protein to the diet. The slicing and cooking of bacon produced not just the crispy meat itself, but also the rendered fat, or bacon grease, that was saved and used for cooking everything from eggs to vegetables, making bacon a foundational ingredient whose influence extended far beyond the meat itself. Pickling vegetables in vinegar created preserved foods that added crucial variety and some vitamins to the winter diet, when fresh vegetables were unavailable, and when stored root vegetables were becoming monotonous. The pickling process required vinegar, salt, and often spices like dill, mustard seed, or peppercorns that added flavor while contributing their own preservative properties. Cucumbers were the most commonly pickled vegetable, transformed into the pickles that accompanied nearly every meal, and that provided a sharp, tangy counterpoint to rich meats and bland starches. After several days in salt, the cucumbers were rinsed and packed into crocks or jars with vinegar that had been spiced and sometimes sweetened, creating a brine that would preserve the cucumbers while transforming their flavor. The sealed containers were stored in cool cellars, where the pickles would develop in flavor over weeks and months, becoming more complex as the vinegar and spices penetrated the cucumber flesh. But on the natural fermentation of the cabbage itself, creating lactic acid that preserved it. The shredded cabbage was mixed with salt in proportions of roughly 2 tablespoons of salt per 5 pounds of cabbage, and the mixture was packed tightly into crocks or barrels, with each layer being pounded with a wooden tamper to break down the cell walls and release juice. As the layers accumulated, the cabbage released enough liquid to cover itself completely, and weights were placed on top to keep the cabbage submerged and to exclude air that would allow spoilage instead of fermentation. The crock was covered loosely to allow gases to escape while preventing debris from falling in, and it was left in a cool place for weeks or months while fermentation proceeded. The natural bacteria on the cabbage leaves fermented the sugars into lactic acid, creating the sour flavor characteristic of sauerkraut, while simultaneously preserving the cabbage through the acidity. Drying fruits created preserved foods that were intensely flavored and highly concentrated in sugars, providing sweetness during winter months when fresh fruit was a distant memory. Apples were the most commonly dried fruit, sliced into rings or sections and strung on threads that were hung near the hearth, or in any warm, dry location where the moisture would gradually evaporate. The drying process took days or weeks depending on temperature and humidity, and the shriveled dried apples that resulted could be stored in sacks or barrels where they would keep for months. The dried apples were reconstituted by soaking in water before being used in pies, sauces, or stewed as a side dish, the soaking restoring some of the texture, though never quite recreating fresh apple. Other fruits including peaches, plums, and berries could also be dried, though apples' abundance and reliable drying qualities made them the primary fruit subject to this preservation method. The dried fruit was sometimes stored with sulfur treatment to prevent darkening and to deter insects, though this was less common in home preservation than in commercial operations. Sugar preservation represented the most expensive and luxurious preservation method, accessible mainly to wealthy families who could afford the quantities of imported sugar required to make jams, jellies, and preserved fruits. The principle behind sugar preservation is similar to salt preservation. High concentrations of sugar draw out moisture and create environments where bacteria and molds cannot thrive, though the mechanisms are slightly different. Making jam or jelly required cooking fruit with sugar in proportions that typically approached equal weights of fruit, and sugar, boiling the mixture until it reached the proper consistency. The resulting preserves were intensely sweet and flavorful, providing luxury foods that could be spread on bread, used in tarts and cakes, or served as accompaniments to meats in the complex dishes that wealthy colonists favored. The making of preserves was seasonal work that fell to women, who spent long, hot days standing over kettles of boiling fruit. Root cellars represented perhaps the simplest preservation method, using the earth's natural insulation to maintain cool but not freezing temperatures that slowed decomposition while preventing the freezing that would damage vegetables. The construction of a root cellar required digging into the earth or building against a hillside to take advantage of the stable underground temperatures, creating a space that remained around 40 degrees Fahrenheit through winter, regardless of outside temperatures. The floor was typically earth or sand, which could be dampened to maintain humidity that prevented vegetables from drying out. Vegetables were stored in the cellar using various methods depending on their type. Potatoes might be piled in bins with sand or sawdust between layers. Carrots and other root vegetables were packed in boxes of sand. Cabbages were sometimes hung from the rafters or stacked on shelves, and apples were wrapped individually or layered with straw to prevent touching. The management of stored food through winter required constant vigilance, as any food that began to spoil could infect surrounding food and create cascading losses that could devastate a family's winter supplies. And they monitored barrels of salt pork, crocks of sauerkraut, and hanging hams for any signs of spoilage or pest infestation. Mice, rats, and insects posed constant threats to stored food, requiring physical barriers, traps, and constant vigilance to prevent losses. The root cellar had to be opened periodically for ventilation, while avoiding exposure to freezing temperatures that would damage the stored vegetables, requiring judgment about when to open vents and when to seal them against cold. The successful management of stored food was a point of pride for housewives, and a well-stocked cellar that lasted through winter into spring represented both skill and prosperity. Spring brought the end of stored food and the relief of fresh greens and fish runs, though it was also the starving time, when stored food ran out before new food became available, making it the most dangerous season despite the renewal of growth. The cycle repeated endlessly, with each year's success or failure in preservation determining the comfort or suffering of the following winter. The preserved foods that resulted were often quite different from fresh foods in flavor and texture, but colonists adapted their palates to appreciate salted, the modern preference for fresh food and the modern ability to have fresh food year-round would seem strange to colonists who understood that food existed in different forms at different times of year and who appreciated each form for what it offered. The transformation from this seasonal preservation-based food system to the modern system of constant availability represents one of the most profound changes in how humans relate to food, made possible by technologies that colonists couldn't have imagined, but that have fundamentally altered what and when we eat. Segment 10. The kitchen and cooking methods expanded. Colonial cooking took place in front of an open hearth, a dangerous and exhausting process that bears little resemblance to modern cooking with its temperature-controlled ovens, precise timers, and safety features designed to prevent burns and fires. Cooks managed multiple tasks at different heat levels by moving pots closer to or farther from the flames, requiring constant attention. Meat roasted on spits that had to be turned regularly to ensure even cooking, either by hand in a process that required someone to stand in front of the hot fire for hours. Baking happened in Dutch ovens, covered iron pots that were buried in hot coals, with additional coals placed on the flat lid, creating an enclosed space that heated from both top. And burn injuries were common enough that many colonial women carried scars from their kitchen work, with some injuries being severe enough to cause disability or death. Creating conditions that modern occupational safety regulations would never permit. The open flame meant food often tasted smoky, a flavor that colonists accepted as normal and even desirable, rather than as a flaw to be avoided, and that gave colonial cuisine characteristics that are hard to recreate with modern equipment. Recipes relied on imprecise measurements, like a handful or the size of a walnut, or butter the size of an egg, and cooking times were judged by experience rather than clocks. Making colonial cooking as much art as science, and requiring years of training to master. The absence of standardized measurements and precise temperatures meant that the same recipe could produce quite different results, depending on who made it and under what conditions, creating variation that was accepted as normal, rather than as a sign of failed technique. The firebox was constructed of brick or stone that could withstand extreme heat, and the chimney had to draw properly to remove smoke from the room, while providing enough draft to keep the fire burning well. The hearth opening was usually equipped with various devices for supporting pots and food, including cranes that swung in and out, trammel hooks that could be adjusted to different heights, pot hooks of various lengths, and sometimes more elaborate mechanical systems for managing multiple cooking tasks simultaneously. And to create a durable surface that could withstand the constant traffic and heat. The cast iron pots and pans used for hearth cooking were valuable possessions that represented significant investments and that were cared for carefully to ensure they lasted for generations. The pots themselves ranged from small saucepans holding a quart or less to massive cauldrons that could hold 10 gallons or more, with each size suited to different tasks and different household sizes. The heat from above and below created conditions similar to a conventional oven, allowing bread, cakes, biscuits, and other baked goods to cook evenly. The skill in using a Dutch oven lay in managing the quantity and distribution of coals to create the right temperature, something that required experience and judgment since there was no temperature gauge. A skilled cook could produce beautifully baked bread and perfectly risen cakes in a Dutch oven, while a less experienced one might end up with burnt bottoms and raw tops, or with items that never cooked through at all.